Hey witches, Tiffany here on Bewitching.Bemused. Today we're going to cover the history of the Sabbat Beltane. I know I covered the history of the Sabbats last year, but I had a lot going on at the time of Beltane, and so I just happened to miss this one. So we're getting caught up now. Here it is. Just like with those ones, I am only scratching the surface with this topic. There are a ton of resources that I will list down below in the description box. And additionally, this is about the history. So if you are looking for correspondences for the day, spells you can do, decor, activities, that sort of thing, I do have a video all for that I did 2 years ago that I will link down below as well. With this being the peak of spring, we are still looking at fertility, which is generally a theme all throughout the spring, beginning to end. Now that said, this is also about the intermingling and duality between masculine and feminine energies. This Sabbath also focuses on sexuality and sensuality. Now, in times past, if you were to attend a pagan festival, a lot of times rituals and performances focused around it being male and female. If you look at the story of the god and the goddess, again, it's male and female coming together. Now, I do want to state that this is a very heteronormative view, and of course, times have changed. While you never have to celebrate any Sabbath or any aspect of a Sabbath that doesn't resonate with you, I never, ever want anybody to feel like they are excluded. Again, this whole thing can come across as very gender conformist and heteronormative, but it does not have to be quite that binary. Let's first talk about the observation of the masculine and feminine. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, that could be limited to the masculine and feminine within nature. So you have the pistil and stamen, you have the seed in the soil. You also don't have to look at how they work together as two separate things. You can look at how they mingle together and coexist on a spectrum. The same can be said for the aspects of fertility and sex. This is not just about the human reproductive process. When we talk about fertility, this is creation of all kinds. Again, you could just focus on nature, so you could look at animals, you can also look at plants, but you can also look at the way that stone and water works together to create a canyon. You can also look at creation within your own life, putting pen to paper, right? So it could be something creative. It could also be starting a new business venture, starting a new job, a new relationship, a new friendship. Fertility is not just about making babies. It's also not just about the creation of new life or new life within our natural world. It's also about new ideas, new plans, new goals. Additionally, when you step away from the fertility aspect and you observe the sexuality that is inherent in Beltane, it is not limited to masculine and feminine. It is not limited to creating offspring. It is about sex as a source of pleasure, which, yes, I do believe should be celebrated. But I also think that anything that brings you pleasure, brings about ecstasy, should be celebrated. So if you happen to be asexual, then yes, I do feel that that aspect, that celebration of pleasure in and of itself still applies to you because it doesn't have to be sexual pleasure. So I just wanted to point out a few different ways that we could come at Beltane from a different perspective to be a little bit more inclusive. And so it can work for everybody. But like I said, again, you do not have to celebrate any Sabbath or any aspect of a Sabbath that does not resonate with you. It will not make you any less of a witch, any less of a pagan, or anything else to just say, just not really into that one. Okay, that said, Beltane is a really interesting Sabbath in that it is one of the only ones that was never absorbed by and recycled into a Christian holiday. However, just like the other cross-quarter days, this is yet another Irish Celtic holiday. Beltane first appears in historical record in Cormac's Glossary in 900 CE. Now, Cormac's Glossary was written by somebody with ties to the Catholic Church. So, take the definition with a grain of salt, but Beltane is defined as both lucky fires as well as, and I'm just gonna read this, two fires which druids used to make great incantations, okay, and they used to bring the cattle as a safeguard against the diseases of each year to those fires. They used to drive the cattle between them. So what the ancient Celts would do is they would take their cattle, which was of course some of their most important livestock and sources of food, and they would drive them, like literally walk them, guide them between these two fires because they felt that it would help protect them from diseases over the coming year. They also felt that the two fires would protect their crops from diseases and pests and such, and they also felt that the fires would keep the Fae at bay. You can probably tell, and from what we know about how the ancient Celts celebrated this particular day. And keep in mind, like most of the Sabbats, a lot of that information has been lost to time and we don't know everything about it. But it was, while yes, a fire festival, it was much more ominous. It was much more about protection and preparation as opposed to, you know, kind of how we view Beltane now, which is this free-spirited, let loose, get a little wild, get a little weird, but also dance, frolic, have fun, be playful, be merry. And it's also very contrasting to some of the ways that we know the ancient Celts celebrated some of the other cross-quarter days. However, it wasn't completely dreary. The Celts also did believe that a person could jump over the Beltane fire for good luck. There is sometimes some incorrect information floating around that says that the name Beltane is linked to a particular deity. And while, yes, there are deities that have names similar to the word Beltane, no, that's incorrect as far as we can tell from the historical record. In fact, the common spelling of the name Beltane, because there's a lot of different spellings and all of them are fine, but one of the most common ones does come from the book The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer. It's also believed to come from the Celtic root word bel, which means lucky, fortunate, or bright. For many, many centuries, including well after Christianity had sort of taken over the British Isles, Beltane has been celebrated as a fire festival. In fact, the ancient Celts are not the only ones to have done so. In Germany on April 30th, which, yes, Beltane tends to fall on May 1st, but occasionally it does fall on April 30th. Anyway, in Germany on April 30th is Walpurgis Night. This had Christians building bonfires to keep witches at bay. And they invoked Saint Walpurga, who the night was named after, to protect them. Now, it is interesting that the two completely separate locations did see the value of lighting fires at this time, partially for protection, although from different sources. However, it's not commonly believed that one was necessarily inspired by the other because of the distance between the two locations. Like I mentioned, very little is known about the original Irish Celtic Beltane, just like a lot of the Sabbats. However, most contemporary Beltane traditions come from post-pagan Europe. Now, here's the big difference between the traditions that overlap with Beltane and contemporary customs in other Sabbats. These traditions that developed in post-pagan Europe were not Christian traditions. They were from secular celebrations. English May Day celebrations would look very familiar to a present-day pagan because that is where we get our customs of the maypole, the May royalty, May Queen and May King, as well as Jack in the Green. We don't know for sure, but it is theorized that a lot of these original English May Day customs come from Germanic paganisms that were observed in England in the medieval era. Now, yes, those were types of paganisms, but as far as we know, there is no link between those ones and the Irish Celtic practices in regards to Beltane, and we're looking at two very, very different time periods between those two. Just to be clear, I like to say this in most videos, when it comes to traditions, I don't think that, one, you have to stick to any tradition, and just because something is older versus more contemporary doesn't make it more valid or more legitimate. Yes, there are traditionalists out there that do try to practice both the Sabbats as well as their magical practices, as much as they can, very similar to the way that the ancients did. However, this isn't the way for everybody. And additional to that, a lot of ways that they practiced, a lot of customs that they had would have no application for us today in our contemporary world. So again, just because something's newer doesn't make it less valid. I just like to point out these differences of where things came from and when things came from, because it's informative and interesting to know. The first mention of May Day in the historical record was in 1240, and this was a day of frivolity and fun. You would welcome in May and play games. Now, the maypole, which is probably one of the most popular features of the season, now, it's been around for quite a while. We'll touch on that in just a second, but I did want to say that its ties to sexuality, its symbolism as a phallus, is relatively new. We're talking like the last 200 years or so. The earliest record that we can find of the maypole dates back to the 1300s, but a lot of historians believe that it does date back to the ancient pagans. We'll get back to the maypole in just a second, but still speaking on sexuality, Beltane itself and its link to sexuality seems to date back about 700 years. So you can see it still took quite a while for the maypole to get pulled into that aspect. And I really want to quote Jason Mankey here in one of his articles because I think he phrased it very well. I'm gonna read it straight off my screen. Why can't people simply enjoy being outside playing a game or two? Why does it have to turn into a 12-foot tall penis? I can think of better things to dance around. So can I. Originally, maypoles were raised in rural communities to not only mark the end of winter, but also to mark a gathering place. Over time, eventually, they started getting decorated. People would add spring florals and greenery, and in some locations and time frames, they would also add ribbons, which is what we commonly see now, as well as flags. Over time, its use became a little bit less practical, right? But in a fun way. It became less about, oh, I see it, I know where to go for the gathering place. And it became more of a beacon of a location where you can dance and have fun. There is a bit more to the ancient and older versions of Beltane and May Day, but nowadays a lot of those aspects of Beltane have sort of been doled out to other holidays, other Sabbats, and to other parts of the year. So I mentioned earlier, fear of the Fae. We don't really talk about that having to do with anything with Beltane anymore. The pageantry of Beltane sort of went to Easter. That time frame also used to get used as sort of the first coming out for spring, especially in locations where winter lasted pretty long and it took a while for snow to melt and things to actually really settle into spring. And that's when you would produce your, you'd bring out your livestock and show it off to people. Check out my cow. Nowadays, we attribute that to Memorial Day. Of course, we barbecue and a lot of fairs happen around that time. And of course, there was this sort of mischievous upending of the social structure. But nowadays and over time, that sort of got more attributed with Yule time and with Samhain, just sort of depending on the culture and the region and the time frame that you're looking at. Well, that's it. This one's a pretty quick and easy one. I know there is symbolism that can be looked at from lots of different perspectives, but otherwise it's a pretty straightforward day. It's about still celebrating the fact that the sun is getting stronger, light is getting stronger. Our days are continuing to get longer until we reach our peak longest day of the year at midsummer or the summer solstice. We are also looking at masculine and feminine energies colliding or coming together, working together, mingling, or the duality thereof, as well as sexuality, sensuality, and fertility. And of course, pleasure and ecstasy, and just overall having fun, having a good time. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm only scratching the surface here, so if you want some more information, check out those resources listed down below. In the meantime, if you'd like to check out information on any other Sabbats, how to celebrate any of the Sabbats, including Beltane, or just the history of the Wheel of the Year, or how to make it work for your own life, you can check out my whole playlist all about the Sabbats right here.